like we have all found a partner or are getting there. One at a time, listen, these instructions are important. One at a time, I would like you to tell the other person about your names. For most of us, that is a first, middle, and last name. It might also include a chosen name, married name, or nicknames. You choose the names that you want to tell the stories of, but you have 1 minute to tell the stories of your names, and then we will switch partners. So I am timing this. First person, go. The bell, that means it is time for the second person to share their names. So thank you, everyone, for indulging in that short experiment. I know we can do this. Here we go. So thank you for indulging me in that little exercise, and thank you for sharing a little bit of yourself with someone that you may have just met. These names that we carry around and use all the time hold the seeds of some amazing stories. And those stories are in many part, they're part of what makes us who we are. Our last names often tell the stories of our social location. They've defined our access to power a lot of times, the language that we first learned, the cultural assumptions that we were raised with, and much of the way we see the world is baked into that last name. Our first and middle names were often bestowed upon us by our family. Consider for just a moment the choosing of your name. It may have been chosen by one parent or in discussion with a wider network of family or community. Whatever name they chose, our parents laid their hopes and dreams upon us in that name. It was bestowed upon us. Some of you at some point That name might not have fit any longer. You took a nickname or a chosen name as a point of departure, a point of claiming our own identity or charting a new course, or perhaps coming to know your own body or your own identity in a way that couldn't be understood when you were first born. Even those few simple words of our names are packed with stories. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the layers of story upon story that make us who we are. There's a children's story that I told last year or maybe the year before. It's a story by Christopher Buisse called A Beautiful Tiger. The story says something like, once upon a time there was a beautiful and powerful tiger, but she had been captured by a mean and cruel person who put her in a cage. She lived in that cage in the jungle, and every day he would bring out a bowl of food and some water to that lonely tiger, and sometimes the tiger would see her reflection and think, "Oh, I am beautiful." But the man heard her and said, "No, you are not a beautiful tiger. You are ugly. You are a pitiful creature." Sadly, she believed him. Some days, as she ate her food, she would walk back and forth in her small cage and feel her energy and her muscles move, and she thought, "I must be powerful." The man heard her say these words, and he said, "No, you are weak and puny. Why would you be in this cage if you were powerful? You are a pitiful creature." One day, a lion happened to walk by her cage while the man was gone, and the lion saw this beautiful tiger in her cage, and he said, "You beautiful, powerful creature, what are you doing in this cage?" The tiger figured this lion was being sarcastic. "Stop making fun of me." "I'm not making fun of you," the lion said. "You're the most beautiful, powerful tiger I've ever seen. It's just strange that you're lying here." The tiger wasn't sure at first, so she began pacing a little bit, and she could feel this energy and strength welling up in her body, and as she moved, she felt more and more empowered. Suddenly, she threw herself against the door of the cage, and it just flew open. Once outside, she was dazed. That cage didn't even have a lock on it. I spent much of my life there behind that door when it wasn't even locked, she thought. The lion looked at her and said, "Yeah, those are the traps that don't need any locks. It's the lies we believe that keep us in those cages, and it's the truth that sets us free." No, none of us are tigers. Hopefully, we haven't experienced being locked behind bars. Yet nearly all of us, I imagine, have been trapped at one time or another by a story that deeply limited our idea of what we thought was possible. This fable is a little silly, but the story we tell ourselves, all of those stories, have incredible power. It can sometimes be useful to think of those stories in comparison to literature or actual writing. In a good piece of writing, we forget that every word on that page or that book was a choice by the author. Every scene, every plot twist, every limit, every surprise, the author makes so many critical choices that the reader just assumes that this is the universe that has been created and enters into that world. Every story creates a little universe, a world in which different things are possible or impossible. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the TV series Schitt's Creek. It's a particular style of humor. It's not for everyone. I think it's hilarious. It has a very devoted fan base. Two of the characters in this show are young gay men who develop a relationship in a pretty rural town. And you may not have noticed this if you watch the show, but something really special is happening in that story. There is zero trace of homophobia, either in the town or the families of these men. The writers, Eugene and Dan Levy, made this very intentional choice. They figured there was plenty of that kind of negativity and challenge in the world and in other stories. What if we just once create a world where other challenges exist? Hearts get broken, and money challenges are real, and families are imperfect and awkward. But let's just once leave homophobia completely out of this universe. And it made for a delightful show. My point is, writers make intentional choices in their storytelling. And those assumptions get baked in to the narrative without us even noticing it sometimes. Another big choice for writers is the point of view. The Reverend Sandra Fees talks about reading William Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury. The novel begins with a chapter written from the perspective of Benjamin, or Benji, who is a 33-year-old with cognitive disabilities. She knew immediately that she was reading something very different. Reading a whole chapter from that character's perspective was eye-opening, especially for her as a young reader. For the first time, she was introduced to the idea of what it might be like to experience the world through someone's very different eyes from her own. William Faulkner became known for his experimental writing and telling stories from different perspectives and sometimes even out of sequence. We're more accustomed to that now through movies and books, but it was really cutting edge in the early 20th century. Literature through different perspectives is an invaluable learning opportunity. Now, we can't really see our own life through another person's eyes, but it can be useful from time to time to imagine how another character in any of our own stories might have interpreted that moment. Like just a minute ago when I asked you to consider the thought process of those who gave you your first name and what they might have been feeling and thinking in that process. What about seeing an argument you recently had from the other end? Or perhaps seeing the world through the eyes of someone that you really helped. I know everyone in this room has been deeply appreciated by another person at some point. Have you taken the moment to imagine seeing yourself and that story through their eyes? Now, there's one big difference between our stories and the stories in books and films. Our life stories change with time and perspective. They're not written and closed. We gain appreciation of our parents as we grow into adulthood and experience for ourselves some of what they went through as our parents. And I imagine those of you who are a little older than me, as you navigate senior years, you too appreciate the experiences your parents went through in a whole new way. Some of you know I've spent a good chunk of time reflecting on stories that involve adoption of children. This week I ran across a story that Reverend Karen Anderson tells. It's the story of a friend of hers. Her friend Lynn was born in Korea and adopted to a white family in the United States. The story that Lynn was told was that she was brought to the adoption agency in Korea in a basket with clean, pressed clothes on, swaddled in a nice blanket, and a note pinned onto the front of her chest that read, quote, "Please help take care of our family. We're very poor, and you can make a difference to our child." It's a touching, innocent story. Lynn had no particular reason to doubt this story from her family. Rev Karen says that as she heard her friend Lynn recounting this story of her origin, her friend showed some burn marks that she had on her arm and the back of her legs. Now, during college, Lynn enrolled in an international women's studies course, and she learned about the decade of transnational adoption from Korea, China, and Russia to the United States. She learned about those historical circumstances, and it became apparent that her story might not have been as perfectly sweet as it had been told to her. In fact, there was a good chance that her burns were not by accident, and that she was likely a child of neglect. A couple of years later, Lynn ran across another transnational adoptee from Korea, very close to the same age, with a very similar experience. That person, she found, had been even more curious than herself, and she went on the long trek back to Korea to investigate her story. She went to the adoption agency to find any information that she could. When she arrived, she was told the exact same story as Lynn. That she showed up in a basket, clean clothes, laundered blanket, the same details, down to the exact same words pinned to her chest. When Lynn heard the broken record story, her own mythical origin story shattered completely. The possibility that the burn marks were accidental flew out the window, and she was left to create another narrative, probably left somewhere by parents, maybe a field or a street. She tried to talk to her adopted parents about it, but their loving minds couldn't make space for a different possibility. Lynn, however, was grateful for a deeper insight into her truth. It changed her self-perception, or maybe not changed it, but solidified it. She knew that she was a resilient, flexible, and strong person. But as she knew more of where she came from, she came to understand that more deeply. She realized that her internal drive to make a positive impact on her world came from somewhere deep in her bones, somewhere unconscious, before words. Lynn's story isn't just about becoming okay with the past. It's not just about reconciliation or forgiveness. For her, that shift in narrative was a hinge moment, a turning point that set the story for the rest of her life in a slightly different, stronger position going forward. Abuse and abandonment are pieces of her past, but it's not the ending or even the climax of her story. As an adult, those pieces join together with years of other experience to enliven a passionate, justice-building person that she is today. I've heard lots of stories of adoption. Some of them are incredibly gentle and beautiful and redemptive. Others are heart-wrenching. And just like those names that everyone in this room carries, those pieces of identity, those major points in the plot line are important. But they are not a whole story. They're calling out for reinterpretation and meaning. We have all had bumps along the road. Some of us, perhaps most of us, have sustained serious challenges, traumas along the way. But we are here, telling the story of our life today. Not just telling it to other people, but telling it to ourselves. Brené Brown says that when we have the courage to walk into our story and own it, we get to write the ending. And when we don't own our stories of failure or setback or hurt, they own us. So I guess I would close by asking you to think a little bit of yourself. What are the major stories about yourself and how you came to be who you are? They're different for everyone. Most of us have a story of vocation or life work. Has that been a part of your identity? Was it fulfilling? And this is also relative, really. It's hard to know, how much do other people really love their work? How fulfilling is this supposed to be? When you think of your work, do you take into account the day-to-day difference you made in the relationships and just the presence of being there with other people? That may have been just as impactful as the work itself. What's the story you tell yourself about what you do or have done or will do? We might also ask, what's the story of our romantic life? This is probably one of the most complicated stories. That's why there are so many songs and movies and books. And again, it is so relative. How satisfied and happy am I supposed to be? Those of you who immediately have a memory of that one great romance, do you see yourself as lucky or someone that earned that beautiful piece of life through your efforts? For the relationships that ended, can you still look back and appreciate the good parts? I'm reminded of the now oh-so-famous line from the musical Wicked. Because I knew you, I had been changed for good. It's a little bit saccharine. It's very saccharine, actually. But it's also really powerful and a tremendous goal. To be changed for the better by our relationships. The way that happens is how we come to understand them and the stories we tell about that relationship. Of course, we also each come from a family background. We've all been telling those stories and retelling them and refiguring them for decades. For each of those, for any story in our life, I invite you to consider a vision in which you are a villain and a vision in which you are a hero. And remember that the truth is probably somewhere in between. The other big question, probably the biggest that I would ask, is where have you been an actor and where have you been acted upon? Can you tell your story in a way that is both compassionate for what has happened to you, but still highlights the agency that you have today? Can you tell your story in a way that is compassionate for what has happened to you, but highlights the agency that you have today? Rethinking some of those entrenched pieces of our identity is confusing work. Trying on a different perspective can feel awkward, even guilty, if it means attempting to shed the weight of the old stories that we've been told by family. But give it a whirl. And remember that for a different story to become real or powerful to you, it's something that has to be repeated, something to sit with, something that you have to start living out of as if it were true. It makes me so curious as I see your faces wondering and thinking about the fabulous stories that you are chewing on in this room. Amen.